make every effort to take as little time as possible. I'm really going to be talking to you about an ongoing study. It's been ongoing for a long time, I'd say at least 20 years now. And it was something I kind of jumped into pretty much after I got here in the mid-'80s. And it relates to a study that was intended to address the question of the use of prescribed fire in the management of pine forests. I think this group is probably pretty familiar with the big sectors pinelands. You know that the pine tree down here is one species, the South Florida variety / pine. It's a pine that's very similar ecologically to longleaf pine in that it's very tolerant of fire. It has sort of a semi-grass stage where the seedling stays very short for a long time, has long needles, and the seedlings are relatively resistant to fire. Unlike the normal / pine found in northern Florida and Georgia, or loblolly pines like that, if they're small seedlings and fire comes through, they're guaranteed to kill it. So it's a very fire-resistant pine. Our pinelands have lots of salt palmettos. Salt palmettos are found throughout the southeast, again, in pine flatwoods. It's a little more unusual to have cabbage palm as a significant component. This is really because our pinelands are growing essentially on limestone, shallow sandy soil on top, but it's really, I would consider these pinelands to be somewhat transitional between the pine rocklands of the Miami Rock Ridge, where they're really growing right on the limestone, to the normal flatwoods that you find in further north in Florida and elsewhere in the southeast. And there's a few hardwood species found in the understory. Wax myrtle is really the most common. And we also have a few tropical hardwoods like racine in the understory. And then the herb layer is dominated by grasses and sedges. So I got here in the, I believe it's 1984. And one of the issues at the time with regard to prescribed fire was, should you be burning in the wintertime, like most people did? Was this bad? Because the lightning-caused fires occur during the summer rainy season. And at this time frame, there was a real push to kind of go strictly to growing season burns in natural areas. I wasn't convinced that you should completely switch, and that the only good fire was a lightning-caused fire, because there had been people living in South Florida for 10,000 years, and I'm willing to bet my bottom dollar that they started fires. And if you looked at the time, this is before, my goodness here. Sounds like, no, I mean, before we had so much data for big cypress, we had to use the data from North Plains National Park. And there was about 50 years worth of data that had been analyzed, and you could look at it and see that lightning-caused fires occur, oddly enough, in the lightning season, the thunderstorm season. But the largest area burned early in the wet season when things were still pretty dry. Human-caused fires started to increase during the dry season and had to burn the greatest area late in the dry season when it would be most likely that fires would spread the most. And one would guess that indigenous people who started fires wouldn't have been all that different from the distribution of wildfires caused by humans today. Anyway, there was a sort of argument as to whether or not we should be burning the lightning season or not, and I thought that it would be good to look at a number of seasons and establish an experimental study of fire, looking at both the season of burn and the frequency of burn. And we wanted to do large-scale burns, not tiny little plots, but something that would be more on an operational scale, something that a manager might want to actually go out and burn a couple hundred acres or something like that, not just a tiny little plot. We wanted to cover this range of management options, meaning we probably didn't want to go with a super long interval between burns, because the longer the interval, the higher the fuel load and the riskier the fire. We settled upon using Raccoon Point area, which Claire just talked about a little bit, and we all know where it is. It's that red blob there in the eastern part of the preserve. One of the reasons I chose the Rafting Point area, in addition to the nice access road up the 11-mile road to the oil pads that are up there, was that the area had never been logged. And if you look at this figure, the shaded area is areas of the preserve that were logged, according to Gary Patterson and Bill Robertson. They were looking at pinelands from the perspective of red-cockaded woodpecker habitat. But you'll see that in the extreme southern part of the preserve, there's an area, some little patches of unlogged pinelands. That's the Lawson Pines area, south of Gum Slough. And then the extreme eastern part of the preserve, with Raccoon Point being there on the eastern edge. So we had essentially an unlogged virgin pine forest, which is an unusual thing to have. There's one version of the Raccoon Point pinelands, but you have old-growth pine trees with crooked tops, the understory with skull palmetto, little cabbage palms, some tall cabbage palms. I think there's a wax myrtle hiding in the middle, grasses and sedges, etc. So we settled upon 3 seasonal treatments. One is the winter season, or dry season, mid-dry season, which is sort of the traditional southeastern prescribed burning by ranchers and foresters, because it's dependable weather. You can burn a few days after a cold front has brought some rain. You know which way the wind's going to blow, etc. It's an easy burn to do. Then the spring, or the transition between dry season and wet season, is really when most big fires happen. Whether it's human-caused wildfires or lightning-ignited fires, it's going to be that cusp between dry season and the beginning of the rainy season, when you start getting lightning. And then the third season was during the summer, or the wet season, when there's lots of lightning, more ignitions during the middle of the summer, but they tend to be small fires because it's so wet. And then in terms of frequencies, the discussions as to read what do people think, how often do these pinelands burn, is frequently as every 2 years maybe, and 10 years is probably kind of a maximum. We opted to go with 3 years and 6 years for one reason. 6 is a multiple of 3, and this turns out to help in the design, really. And in Raccoon Point, less than 3 years, to burn every 2 years isn't easy, particularly when it's wet, because the grassy fuel is relatively sparse in many cases, so that it's difficult to burn every 2 years. But if you take 3 seasons and 2 frequencies, you end up with a total of 6 treatment combinations. So there's six treatments. Then we had 3 replicates of each of those treatments, which gives you a total of 18 experimental units you need. And we found these up at Raccoon Point. Each one had maybe, well, at least 50 hectares, so over 100 acres of pineland within it. And then because a number of things. For one thing, setting up plots. We couldn't do it all and burn all these plots in 1 year. We had to spread it out over 3 years. So the replicates, for example, a short frequency winter burn, we did 1 in year 1, 1 in year 2, 1 in year 3. And what this meant was that in the initial part of the study, for the first 3 years, we had a total of 6 burns each year, both the short and long frequency of the 3 seasons. Then the second 3 years, years 4 through 6, we would only have 3 burns because we'd only be doing frequent treatment in each season. If that's not confusing enough. Anyway, this is a Google Earth image of the Raccoon Point area for those of you who aren't real familiar with it. But you can see the 11-mile roads, the white line kind of winding up there. You hit pad 1, 2, 3. I don't think pad 4 was here when I first started. I think Cypress, pads 4 and 5. But they provide access to the dark green pine islands that surround it. That is the L28 tie-back example. This bright green is the preserve boundaries. And then these green polygons are the 18 experimental units, each one containing at least 100 acres of pineland and lots of cypress domes. Then in each one of those experimental units, we had 3 tree plots, which were hectare in size, typically 100 by 100 meters, where we mapped, tagged, measured the diameter of all the trees in the plot, the diameter of 5 centimeters or greater. And then cabbage palms, we just measured their height, the height of the trunk, as long as it was 1.4 meters tall or taller. Then in each one of the units, there was also 5 understory vegetation plots. 3 of those vegetation plots were nested within the center of the big tree plot. And then 2 other understory plots were located elsewhere. They were randomly assigned in the unit. And I guess this was to remind me that the hard work of setting out these were permanent plots. There's lots of rebar marking corners and so forth. The Tamiami limestone, which underlies these pinelands, is harder than concrete. We discovered you could not use a portable drill. You had to use an impact drill run by a generator. And so Holly Ballas and crew had to haul around a generator and a big old impact hammer just to drill holes to put rebar in. And most the rebar is still there. A few of them are getting a little wobbly because of rust. But a lot of work setting the plots out there. Now this is a bit of a close-up looking at, that's actually pad 4, and you see the mosaic of cypress domes in gray and the green pinelands. We're going to zoom in on, well, there's a unit over here. This is unit 6, and the points all show the 5 plot locations. To delineate these units, we tried to establish good fire, we tried to use natural or pre-occurring existing fire breaks. In the case of this trail, this area along here, this follows a buggy trail. And this is also a buggy trail, and here is simply sort of following a chain of domes, which generally is a rather effective fire break. I think the fire management people, since they're not here, except maybe, they might mention that a few places we weren't successful in finding fire breaks. So it made their life a little difficult in trying to keep stuff from moving from one unit to the next. But then I think I zoom in. This is actually zooming in at that corner of Unit 6. You can see here's the actual buggy trail coming through the domes. And this is approximately the size of a hectare-sized tree plot. These tree plots had, say, slightly fewer than 200 to over 400 trees per hectare throughout the study area. This is a map created by none other than Dr. Jim Birch, showing the location of the trees in the plot. The circular symbols are pine trees. The solid squares are snags, dead pine trees that are hanging around. The asterisks are cabbage palms, and there's really only 2 tiny little triangles in there. This is one of the plots that had relatively few cypress trees in it. Most of our hectare-sized plots had several to many cypress trees in them. Then the actual burning, we were probably putting in plots beginning around 1990, because it took a long time to get them in. In 94, the fire management folks burned the entire Raccoon Point area to sort of set it all to the same time frame, so that it all starts from the same post-burn time. So in 96, we began the first experimental burns. In that first series of burns, so that first 3 years, we would have been burning 6 plots a year, or 6 units a year. In each unit, we measured fire behavior, or fire severity. We looked at fuel loading before and after the fire so that we could calculate how much the fuel was consumed. We put out about 150 temperature plates. These are metal plates that had temperature-sensitive paints on them that would melt at certain temperatures. Pardon me. Never drink a Coke before you're going to speak. And we also then, immediately after the fire, we went out and evaluated each pine tree for the height of the char on the bark and the percent of the needles that were scorched. And then 1 year later, we went out to see how many of those pine trees were dead. And it turns out relatively few pine trees were dead. Comparing the 3 seasonal treatments, they were all around 2%, slightly more in the winter, but it was not statistically significant. But you can see that the winter burn and all the measures of fire severity, such as the height of the char, the percent scorch, fire temperature, fuel consumption, it was the most severe burn, generally because it's driest then. And if we looked at the mortality of trees was correlated with all these measures of fire severity. and then all the fire measures, of course, were correlated with one another. I'm glad Mindy's here, because Mindy helped very much get these maps put together after TJ took an initial, TJ Hilton took an initial stab. But I'm going to show very quickly, just to run through the maps from 94 through 2012, so you can see what areas burned in Raccoon Point. You'll notice that it didn't work out perfectly. Now I think this is the first time that a prescribed fire study didn't work out perfectly. But I will, a certain amount of naivete, I believe, was involved. When I first got here, the first few years I was here, Raccoon Point wasn't soggy wet in the summertime. I would go up in the summer, and it was wet, but it was in the low spots. Well, of course, after we got it going a few years, you go out and there'd be 3 months when there's 6 inches of water out in the pinelands. You can't do too much prescribed burning with 6 inches of water. So sometimes it was too wet. Then, of course, if it got too dry, the fire management folks wouldn't be able to burn because it was too risky. Or it didn't even have to be too dry here. It just had to be too dry somewhere else. And therefore, they weren't allowed to burn here. We always wondered about that. And then sometimes we're just too busy. But all in all, they've done a great job of doing the burns, but you'll see there are a couple years that the wet years sort of show up. So in these maps, the dark squares are roughly in size, hectare-sized plots, and then probably harder to see, within each unit, there's 2 much smaller 10th hectare plots, which are additional vegetation plots. And the red is really stuff we're not interested in. It's probably not psychologically a great way to have people's eyes drawn to the part you don't care about. But yeah, the kind of brown stuff, that shows units that were burned. The green background would be the unit boundaries that it looks like it didn't quite burn. But pretty much everything burned in 94, so that we know the age, the post-burn age of all the vegetation. Then 95 got a year off. 96 it got started, and in that calendar year, there were 4 units burned, and at that point, they mapped them fairly specifically, so it's more or less the pinelands are shown as being burned, and not the cypress domes. That wasn't always the case, but this is 97, 98, 99, we only got 2. There should have been more units burned. Probably tried to catch up in 2000. Only 1 unit in 2001. It was either too wet or too dry. Same thing in 2002. A lot of catching up in 2003. 2004 looked pretty normal. Really wet in 2005. 2006, catch up. 2007, pretty much, I think, on schedule. 2008, again, I think pretty much on schedule. 2009, 2010, we're getting closer. 2011, oops, there's some little problems down there in the units 13 and 14 in the southeast, but we'll just ignore that. And then this year, 2012, looks like everything's great except that Unit 3 up there in the northeast corner wasn't supposed to burn. And Unit 4, which is right in here, was going to be the last burn to do to finish off this rotation of treatments. We've actually had all the frequently burned plots have had 5 burns since we started, and all the infrequently burned plots, the 6-year plots, have had 3 burns. And unit number 4 is supposed to be the last plot to get burned, but this summer, I forgot to add to the list of too wet, too dry, too busy. I forgot to add panthers. And so panthers took up, some female panther decided she liked Unit 4, and we just weren't allowed to burn when there's a female panther. But it was really nice because it really wasn't super wet in the summer, but it did start getting too dry out west. So then we started, the question was, why are we burning? Well, it's either the panther or the fact that we were under some high-level alert for fire. And by the time the panther left and conditions got better elsewhere in the country, it was October and pretty wet. And so it was too late. We'll get that one in next year, I hope. All the units step number 4, have had the allotted 3 infrequent burns or 5 frequent burns. We've already resampled 4 of the units and have a lot more to do, but they're sort of staggered out over the next 3 years to get them all sampled. And I'm hopeful that the fire management will continue the burns and sort of keep the treatments up, and that someone 20 years from now, other than me, can go back out and remeasure them. I do hope that Adam and I can get something to present next year on the factors causing tree mortality in that first set of different seasonal burns, because I think there's some interesting stuff there. And I would, like, Holly and Marlena did a great deal of work in setting this all up, and luckily, she decided to marry Larry Bellis, the fire management officer. And so for that period, when they were still here, the burns did get done on time. Because, you did not mess with Holly. You did not mess with Holly. But the fire management staff has universally been very good about it. They've gotten the burns done. And I should recognize T.J. Hilton and Andrew Moore helped with this most recent resampling the last 4 years.